Good afternoon. I am Fuad Naeem, Director of the Encountering Islam Initiative of the Theology Department at the University of St. Thomas. I want to very warmly welcome you to our third annual Terrence Nichols Memorial Symposium. Thank you so much for joining us today. The symposium is named in the memory of Terrence Nichols, longtime professor and founder of the Muslim-Christian Dialogue Center at St. Thomas, a pioneering effort in Muslim-Christian dialogue in the Twin Cities area and beyond. Today, the Theology Department continues his legacy with the Encountering Islam Initiative, which is dedicated to fostering Muslim-Christian engagement at the University of St. Thomas and in the local Twin Cities area by creating awareness of Islam, presenting Muslim voices, and facilitating Christian-Muslim interactions and theological conversations. There could be few Muslim voices as resonant to both Muslim-Christian dialogue or the environmental crisis as Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr, our esteemed speaker today. We're truly honored to have with us Dr. Nasr, one of the most acclaimed and celebrated Muslim thinkers living today, to share his perspective, touching upon two topics that he has been a pioneer in, not only the Muslim community, but the larger scholarly community. Dr. Nasr has been involved in interreligious dialogue for well over half a century, and he has written on and participated extensively in dialogue between Islam and other religions, both Abrahamic as well as non-Abrahamic. He has had particular engagement with the Catholic tradition, even leading a Muslim delegation to visit then Pope Benedict XVI after the Common Word letter was written by Muslim scholars from around the world seeking to build bridges of understanding between Christianity and Islam, the world's two largest religions. Dr. Nasr's record on the environment is perhaps even more groundbreaking, as he penned his first work on the subject, Man and Nature, the Spiritual Crisis in Modern Man, back in 1967. Long before it became fashionable to speak of the environmental crisis, and when it was still not widely recognized that there was even such a crisis. This book and his following books on the subject remain a clarion call to environmental awareness and the central role religion and spirituality can play in finding alternatives to the grave situation that we have put ourselves in through an impoverished understanding of who human beings truly are and why we are here on this earth, made possible through a modern culture of unchecked technological development without metaphysical or ethical grounding and an accompanying culture of greed and consumption. Dr. Nasr is the author of over 50 books and hundreds of articles, translated into dozens of languages, on Islamic studies, Islamic philosophy, religion and science, mysticism, comparative religion and the environment, among other topics. Born in Iran, Dr. Nasr received his master and doctoral degrees from MIT and Harvard, returned to Iran, where he taught at Tehran University and founded the Iranian Academy of Philosophy, among many other activities, before returning again to the US in the 1980s, where he's university professor of Islamic studies at George Washington University in Washington, DC. On a personal note, it was my privilege to study under Dr. Nasr in graduate school, and he has been a trusted mentor ever since, and I'm truly delighted to see him again here at the University of St. Thomas, even if it's only on Zoom. After his talk, Dr. Nasr will be glad to take your questions, so please prepare them as you listen and submit them through the question and answer feature on the webinar, and I'll collect them and present it to him. I also wanted to thank everyone who assisted in making this symposium possible. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, who is the foundation of our lives, both Muslim and Catholic. Dr. Naeem, I'm very glad to see you at least on this little screen. I know Dr. Naeem well, and he's one of the very gifted young scholars of Islamic studies, for whom I pray will have to have a very fine career academically, as has already shown in the last few years. I'm also very pleased to be in contact, if virtual and not actual, with St. Thomas University. I've visited St. Thomas University in days of old and lectured there more than once. I know it's a major Catholic university, and I'm very glad to be able to share a few minutes with you on this crucial issue. The title of my talk was chosen by Dr. Naim, and it involves really Christianity, Islam, and the environmental crisis. Uh, Let me begin with a little history. Uh, it was 1964 when I was at the American University of Beirut, established the chair of Islamic studies there, which I'm Persian myself, was then living in Tehran, when Mircea Eliade, the famous professor of comparative religion or history of religions at the University of Chicago, who was a friend, contacted me and said that the professor, a scientist called Professor John Ross, who will come to see you, and we want you to give a series of lectures on religion and the environment, which was not then a common issue and popular to discuss. So Dr. Ross came, he met me both in Beirut and also when I went back to Tehran. And I accepted, and in 1966, I gave the Rockefeller Series of Lectures in the University of Chicago, entitled The Encounter of Man and Nature, which later on came out as a book called Man and Nature, which has been translated into many languages now, French and Italian and other languages, and also into some Islamic languages. Uh, the result of that was that I hope a new awareness began to be created about this important issue. 6 months later, Lynn White, who had also already listened to my lecture in the University of Chicago, brought out his famous essay on the Christianity and ecological crisis, which was very critical of Christianity for being the cause for the environmental crisis. I did not agree with him. My criticism was much more nuanced and very different from his. And so let me begin with my own view, a little bit historically, about Christianity first before I turn to Islam. Christianity appeared in a world which was suffering from naturalism, rationalism, empiricism, and what you could call cosmolatry, the late Greco-Roman world, in a sense, the worship of nature rather than of God. And although it was a Semitic religion like Judaism and Islam, its destiny was to spread into the West. And so it became heir really to all the problems that it had to face in that world. And it was providential that its form was what it was. And the New Testament speaks very little about nature. The Old Testament does. That's, of course, the Torah, the Jewish part, but which is also part of the Christian scriptures. But the New Testament occasionally has reference to the world of nature, but not very much, as we found in the Psalms and other books of the Old Testament. And the early Christians were concerned because they were destined to face the Greco-Roman world, whose center was not the Middle East, but the West, to face that world. And so the early Christian fathers developed mostly a theology based on love and love of human beings, and criticism of, as I said, rationalism, which was so prevalent at that time, and the kind of naturalism which had, in a sense, percolated down into the early Christian period from a certain strand of Greek thought that went back to the Ionian period and the earliest foundation of Greek philosophy. Although what the early Greek philosophers have said about nature is not to be confused with the materialistic naturalism which has come into the fore in our world, in fact, for several centuries now in the West. Anyway, Christianity spreads into the West, And most of the great Christian thinkers, like St. Augustine, who is the founder of Western theology, Western Christian theology, Catholic theology, speak mostly about issues dealing with the human being and God, and not too much about the spiritual significance of nature. But there are others, like Origen, for example, who present a metaphysical view, really, in which the Logos plays also a very important role in the created order, and not only in human affairs and religion itself and ethics. But this remains a kind of, uh, I would not say peripheral, but somewhat marginalized aspect of development of Christianity in the West. There are exceptions, going back to the writings of Dionysius the Areopagite, who unfortunately is oftentimes called the pseudo Dionysius. I don't know why they call him pseudo. There's a person called Dionysius, and that's it. Anyway, I never use the word pseudo Areopagite as Dionysius Areopagite, and especially uh, the remarkable 19th century writer Origena, who speaks about nature in a spiritual manner, and the development of the idea of natura naturans and natura naturata in Latin, which means both nature and the nature which makes nature nature, you might say, was an active role as a spiritual element in nature, are gradually developed. And we have the strand in the Middle Ages of Christian history. Middle Ages does not pretend to Islam, it's a category of Christian history, in which you have some remarkable pages written about the spiritual significance of nature. And of course, you have the great saint of the 13th century, St. Francis of Assisi, who, after the Catholic Church realized the significance of the environmental crisis, is now considered to be the patron saint of the environment, denounced by the Catholic Church, who in fact spoke to animals and wrote about nature, and whose perspective on nature is very similar in a sense to that of many Muslim writers. Now, with that background, because of the lack of emphasis upon the theological and spiritual significance of nature as being central, the rationalism that came about, the nominalism of the late 14th century into the Renaissance, neglected more or less the Catholic teachings about Christian teachings about nature. Although during the Renaissance there was a great deal of interest in a particular strand of thought in the West, which we associate with Hermeticism and alchemy, which in fact deal with the world of nature in a spiritual way. Unfortunately, this little lecture does not permit me to delve into it, but at least I have to mention it. That's why you have some flowering in the Renaissance of texts on Christian Hermeticism, which deal extensively with the cosmos, with cosmology, with nature, but it's not central to the Christian theological concern. And it's precisely this neglect or partial neglect that leads to the foundation of modern science, which is based already on a secularized view of nature, going back to Descartes and Galileo, and in a sense, reaching its peak with the mechanization of the world view in the writings of Sir Isaac Newton, who himself was very much opposed, in fact, to what he himself had created. In a sense, he was much more interested in the mystical understanding of nature. It was very interesting. And he was very much interested in alchemy. I mean, in fact, he wrote about these sciences, these esoteric sciences, and we now have those texts, some of which have been studied, although not very deeply yet. But anyway, he epitomizes this new science, which is science of nature, without the spiritual dimension of nature being present. And in a sense, you might say that the transformation of nature from thou to it, from a living reality that which or whom even one can address as thou to a pure it, takes place actually through the Cartesian bifurcation and its consequences in the rise of modern science. That's a very major issue worthy of a study. I've written a few humble pages about it myself, and as have others, but I cannot go into it now, but I would nevertheless must mention it, because what happens in the famous trial of Galileo, which is in which Galileo is put on trial by the Catholic Church, and all the later writings consider Galileo as the hero, whereas in fact what Cardinal Bellarmine, who was on the other side, representing the Catholic Church, said was a very, very great consequence, because he spoke about the religious aspect of nature. But as a result of the Galileo trial and what happened after Galileo, in a sense, the church got its fingers burned, you might say, and disassociated itself completely or almost completely from a concern with the theology of nature, with nature considered not only as as a material conglomerate, but as a living reality and having its own spiritual and intellectual aspects. So that trial is very important for the attitude of the main church of the West, that is the Christian church, towards nature, toward the world of nature. And this lasts into the 20th century. I remember from my own experience when I was at Harvard, started getting my PhD in the 1950s. There were many Catholics, and with whom I knew, there were Catholic theologians, and also later on with a professor, I would meet them, who took great pride. So they said Christianity is the best religion because it was from Christianity that modern science developed. Today, no Catholic would say that anymore after the environmental crisis, but at that time, that was the view. That was the view that was oftentimes held. Islam was not so perfect because it didn't develop modern science, because Newton was not born in Khorasan. That argument went around all around. You cannot imagine how different the situation was at that time. Meanwhile, another very important development took place in the Christian West, which is very, very significant for the environmental crisis, and that is, of course, the rise of Protestantism. Although Martin Luther loved nature and was keeper of a pound even after he became the famous Martin Luther and the founder of Protestantism, nevertheless, Protestantism developed as a kind of a cosmic interpretation of religion with very little interest in the cosmos. Yes, it is true that there were these German theosophers, especially Jakob Böhme, who was Catholic, Protestant, Catholic. I won't get into that now, but he belonged really in different periods of his life to both parts of Christianity, who wrote about the spiritual aspect of nature. But by and large, Protestant theology paid very, very little attention to the theology of nature, the importance of the spiritual relation between the human beings and nature, and was in the background that came the Industrial Revolution, the total domination over nature, and what Philip Sherrard, famous English writer, was originally Anglican and became an Orthodox Christian, wrote in his book called The Rape of Man and Nature, which is a very powerful book, following my Man and Nature. After he read that, he decided to write one from the Christian point of view, which points out what happened actually in the Christian West as far as nature was concerned. So it was not really until the rise of the environmental crisis in the 20th century that gradually Christian writers, including Catholic writers, began to become aware of the significance of this issue. And the first important and notable Christian writings, I don't mean secular, but Western, but Christian Western writings concerning nature really belong to the second part of the 20th century. And it's also very significant for the West today that the environmental movement to protect nature did not arise from Christianity. It arose from people who consider themselves to be secular. And although they had a religious feeling towards nature, they did not identify themselves as Christians. This is a very, very important matter. Today, you have major writers like Wolfgang Smith, John Cobb, before them, Thomas Merton, who were aware of the significance of nature. And in fact, Wolfgang Schmidt has done some of the most important works on, you must say, resacralization of nature, and is a Catholic from the Catholic point of view. But those people come much, much later. The situation of Islam is very different. Islam did not begin in a world. Its challenge was not a world in which there was the danger of rationalism and naturalism in the Greek philosophical sense. It came to a world in which the danger was the idolatry of the age of ignorance, what you call a jahiliyyah in Arabic, the age of ignorance, that is a pre-Islamic Arabs. But the pre-Islamic Arabs were very sensitive to being nomads originally, to the world of nature. So the Quranic revelation in Islam from the very beginning has a very different attitude towards nature. First of all, as I've always said, I do not know. Perhaps it's my ignorance, but beside the Tao Te Ching, there's no sacred scripture of any of the great religions of the world which speaks as often and as profoundly about the world of nature as does the Quran. And the Quran addresses not only human beings, but the world of nature. وَالنَّجْمَ وَالشَّجَرُ يَسْجُدَانِ in Surah Al-Rahman. That is, the stars and the trees prostrate before God. In a sense, the Quranic revelation is revealed not only to men and jinn, the psychic forces, that the word genie in English comes from that, the word jinn in Arabic, but also to the rest of creation. As a very, very strong cosmic dimension, and nature plays a very, very important role in the Quran, and therefore in the consciousness of the Islamic people. On the basis of the Quranic teachings, while Islam developed many sciences of nature, and many wonder, historians of science wonder, why is it that Galileo and Newton were not born in Khorasan or in Egypt or somewhere like that, centers of Islamic learning? But because the worldview that came from the Quran prevented the secular science of nature from developing. Yes, the Muslims developed remarkable science and astronomy, of course, alchemy itself, which came to the West from the Islamic world. The word al is there to show it. Even now, distinguished from chemistry in English or French by the word chimie, alchemy, chemistry. That and mathematics and astronomy, all different sciences, which in fact made possible the rise of Western science in the late Middle Ages in Europe when texts were translated from Latin into Arabic. Despite that, the worldview that the cosmos was sacred, that it was in a sense an independent revelation, independent of us, a revelation by God, that it bore a spiritual and religious message, that there was therefore a nexus, a spiritual nexus between the human being and the cosmos, between the microcosm and the macrocosm. These elements were so deeply ingrained in the Islamic world, in the Muslim mind, that even the greatest scientists, who were scientists in any way you define science, if Newton was a scientist, they were scientists. Nevertheless, the worldview never succumbed to a kind of quantitative or purely quantitative, a materialistic worldview. This is very, very important. From the study of motion of Muslim writers who criticized the Aristotelian theory of motion and tried to quantify motion, which is the foundation of Newtonian physics, to Galileo and Newton, there is, of course, a historical continuity in the sense that Galileo had read some of these late medieval texts, and he had even known the criticisms of Ibn Bajjah, of Empacha, the famous Muslim physicist and philosopher from Spain, upon Aristotle. And the turning of Aristotle into kind of simpleton that Galileo did in trying to oppose Aristotelian physics was with the awareness of his writings. Despite all of that, uh, the West followed a different path. That is, even the question of creating a quantitative physics on a certain level did not destroy the idea that the Muslims had of physics in its original Greek sense, which meant the study of the world of change, of physis. But from a metaphysical point of view, not just a materialistic point of view, from a theological, metaphysical, spiritual point of view. I always remind my students that the great Parmenides, one of the greatest of the pre-Socratic philosophers of Greece, who is oftentimes identified as one of the founders of physics in the old world, called natural philosophy. Of course, physics was not used in that sense. The word natural philosophy was used. Called himself physicos. He says, I'm a physicist in a sense, but of course not in the modern sense at all. Because Parmenides was not talking like Faraday or Newton or Maxwell. He nevertheless used the word physicos as referring to himself. The Muslims were very close to that worldview. And so Islamic science developed on that basis. And because of the character of Islamic revelation, because of the fact that Islam also addresses itself to a large extent, as I said, to the world of nature as well as men, and also in Islam, the word Sharia, which means divine law, we use not only for Islamic law, not only for Christian law or Jewish law or Zoroastrian law, we also use it for the law of various creatures. That is, the birds have their own Sharia, the fish have their own Sharia, the divine law by which they live, except that God has not given them the freedom to rebel against it, where we have the freedom to rebel against God. That's another issue that is a theological issue I will not get into. It's not a subject of my discourse today. But this is very important to understand. And a consequence of this is that the very sharp distinction that Christianity drew between the natural and the supernatural, Islam never drew. There was something supernatural in the natural, something natural in the supernatural. It was not a sharp delineation. From that point of view, the perspective of Islam is very similar to that of primal religions, of let's say the American Indians, who referred to the birds as people, that their own people. They have their own, you might say, divine law. They have their own religious right and so forth and so on. This was something that was very, very important, a re-examination of the idea of natural and supernatural in Islam and its relation to Christianity is very interesting. The reason Christianity had to do that was, as I said, precisely because of the illnesses that it had to treat. That is naturalism and rationalism that the Mediterranean world and Greece and the Roman Empire had inherited from the Greco-Roman civilization. That has to be understood. And that is why in Eastern Christianity, the emphasis is somewhat different from Western Christianity when we come to some of these issues. Again, that's a subject I cannot go into. Someone one day should study the views of Eastern Christian theologians concerning nature and Western Christian theologians. Which would be a very interesting subject. Some things have been written on it, but a lot more work needs to be done. In a sense, Orthodox Christianity, in so many ways, geographically, but also in this field, it stands halfway between Islam and Western Christianity. Anyway, having said all of this, let me turn to the issue now, which is of concern to all of us. Paradoxically, despite this background, the awareness of the environmental crisis arose in the West and then came gradually to the East. Throughout history, major movements of a religious, spiritual, intellectual kind would usually come from the West, East to the West until the modern period. The prophets came from the East. There was no prophet born in France whose religion spread to India or to Iran. The waves, Zoroastrianism, Mithraism, Islam for Eastern Europe, Christianity for Western Europe. And so all of these came from the East to the West. And that was the flow that was there in the traditional period until, as I said, the Europeans rebelled against their own medieval past and also against Islamic influence. And then Europe began to influence the rest of the world, influence going from the West to the East. But spiritually, they could not transform the East because there was not that much spiritual strength in the European colonizing forces to be able to do so. Anyway, the most important, perhaps, or one of the most important elements that came from the West to the East, which had not only a financial and political and economic aspect to it, but a spiritual, intellectual, even religious aspect to it, was the rise of the environmental movement. The awareness of the environmental crisis is one of the few, perhaps from an important point of view, the only idea that came from the West to the East. We have in Islam the idea that at the end of the world, the sun shall rise from the West. And that had many, many meanings and levels of meaning. But this is what happened. It began in the far West in California. When the environmental movement began in California, people in Massachusetts were not at all aware of it. Although Massachusetts, in a sense, is the intellectual center of the United States, with all the universities, like Harvard and MIT and so forth, and old colleges, and Massachusetts and New England in general. It came from the west of the United States to the east of the United States. From there, it came to Northern Europe. And from Northern Europe, it gradually seeped into Southern Europe. In the 1960s and 70s, when the environmental movement had begun, people in Southern Europe were completely unaware of it. They were not interested in it. And places like Italy, Spain, Portugal, to a large extent France itself, were among the last countries to have major environmental movements, where Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Holland, and then Germany became much earlier interested in this matter, and to this day, the environmental movement is the strongest in Northern Europe in comparison with Southern Europe. But while this was taking place, the Islamic world and the rest of the, in fact, non-Western world remained totally impervious to this question. Totally impervious to this question. There are many stories I could tell from my own experience, including the first Earth Day that was held in Stockholm under the aegis of Morris Strong, was an American, Canadian, an American who spent so much effort and time in creating the environmental movement and organized the Earth Day. And I gave the keynote address of that. I went to Stockholm to give the keynote address in Sweden. At that time, the people really interested, mostly Northern Europeans. The communists had sent delegations, but they didn't even consider this to be their problem. This is a problem of capitalism. Both China and Russia had people present, and when I criticized very severely this way of thinking and said the Volga River is one of the most polluted rivers in the world, and it flows throughout the communist world in Russia, the Russian delegation, half of them got up and left the room. They were opposed to it, but they were present. The southern people were not that much interested, and the Muslims, there were very few Muslims. There were some. Iran had sent a big delegation. There were some, but they were not that much interested. In the Islamic world, the whole idea of awareness of the environmental crisis followed another trajectory. Of course, I myself living in Iran and having some influence at that time on different levels, played a humble role in starting the environmental movement in Iran before any Islamic country. Iran is the first Muslim country to have had national parks, to have created national parks, to have tried to have an environmental program, preservation of forests, and so forth and so on. And I wrote a great deal in Persian also, as well as English, on this issue. It's very interesting that my Man on Nature was one of my very last books to come out in Persian. Decades after all these books in Persian or translated into Arabic or other major Islamic language. It's out in Turkish and Arabic, Persian now. But for decades, that was one of my last books. My other books were all over the place. You couldn't find Man on Nature or Islam or Religion and the Order of Nature, which is the second book that I wrote, the Cadbury Lectures on the environment and religion. Anyway, after the Iranian Revolution, for a while they thought, oh, this was all nonsense, all these national parks were destroyed and the peasants were allowed to come back. Many of the species disappeared. You cannot imagine catastrophe that took place. And when Rafsanjani was the president of Iran, he realized this was a disaster, and they revived the idea of the national forest and also an environmental program. They appointed the prime minister, and gradually the idea spread into in Iran and in the other parts of the Islamic world during the last 2-3 decades. The situation has changed very much from 1970, when the first World Earth Day was held in Sweden and Stockholm, now in Egypt, in poor Syria is in terrible state of war. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. But before that, in Syria, in Iraq, in Morocco, in Algeria, in many, many Islamic countries, in Pakistan, also especially Pakistan, and in flying over to the other side of the Islamic world and the Malay world, both Malaysia and Indonesia, there are major movements, important writers who write about the environment, and the environmental issue is now very much alive. Now, because my time is coming to an end, unfortunately, I have to summarize things for you quickly. In the middle of this, where there's the greatest need of close cooperation between Christianity and Islam on issues which involve us all. In fact, they involve the whole earth. When you burn the Amazon forest, it affects the quality of air not only in London, but also in Beijing, and vice versa. Vice versa. When you're destroying the jungles of Borneo, as they're doing now, it will affect the environment in Washington, where I'm sitting right now. There's a chain of relationality, like a physical chain which binds one link to another, which affects everything on Earth if you do something in one part of the Earth. If you pollute the Hudson River, it affects the fish, not only in the Azores, but all the way in West Africa, and so forth and so on. In this situation, unfortunately, there are some very negative elements that still persist. One is, of course, the old colonial mentality that many people in the West still have, that they know better than Eastern people. And they're trying to change, because of economic reasons, the way of living of many people, which makes their way of living much more environmentally unsafe. I always say, if you have a village in Afghanistan, cut off from the rest of the world, it could go on for thousands of years in stability with its natural environment. Whereas New York City could not do that for more than a month. New York City is completely out of harmony with the natural environment around it. It's not only New York City, it's also Karachi, and it's Tehran. I'm not saying it's only in the West now. Unfortunately, this whole idea goes back to colonial period, has not died out, besides proselytizing, which goes on all the time. Still, as if everything was rosy in the West, and that the rest of the world to follow the West, the world would be saved. Besides that, you have also very deeply entrenched economic and political interests of nations more powerful than others, and the colonial heritage, in a negative sense, still continues very much. What we need today is a complete different mindset. That is an awareness that we're all in this boat together. We're all going to either sink together or swim to safety together. This is not like other issues. Wealthy people in this country, for example, heads of companies, who are totally indifferent to the environmental crisis. Their grandchildren are going to need to breathe the same oxygen as the grandchildren of a poor peasant in Bangladesh. You cannot create an island like you used to in the old days for yourself and heck with the rest of the world. That's not going to work because of the nature of the environmental crisis. So what we need most of all is close cooperation. Yes, we can compete with each other. The Quran says vie with each other in goodness, but we should not vie with each other in destroying the environment. Today, I say always, it's jokingly, but I wish it were only a joke. The only thing that all nations are united in is in destruction of the environment. They're united in that. No single country in the world, even where environmental movements are strong, with governments forego economic interests for environmental reasons. There are some cases, yes, in Denmark and Sweden, there's several remarkable events that have taken place. But by and large, things are going downhill in many ways. The city of Delhi is much more polluted today than it was 50 years ago. The city of Lahore, the same. The city of Cairo, the same. Cities in Vietnam, which are Buddhist, the same. Cities in China are doing a great deal to try to clean it up. But air in Beijing, when I visited over a decade ago, 10, 15 years ago, was so polluted you could hardly see across the street. And this is a global matter. And since I'm now only talking about Christianity and Islam, I shall limit my comments to these two religions. What we need most of all is to work together in the care for the environment. God has given the earth to all of us. He has not given it only to Christians, only to Muslims, only to Jews, only to Buddhists, only to Confucians. He's given it to all of us, to Hindus. And therefore, we have to work together in a sense of, first of all, not trying to dominate for economic purposes while overlooking the environmental issues that are involved. I am an extremist. Some people consider me to be extreme in the sense that I say one of the greatest dangers to human beings is economic growth, what is called economic development. Because you cannot have an indefinite growth in a finite space. You cannot do it in physics. You cannot do it in society. You have to, of course, the book's limits to growth. Many people in the West have realized that. But when it comes to practice, every government that tries to come to power in the United States, for example, in elections, they always try to advertise how much they brought about economic growth. But at the expense of what? And this is even worse in the Islamic world. It's worse in the Islamic world. Of course, there are immediate problems of hunger and all kinds of things that go on, but you cannot sacrifice the life of future generations for the well-being of the present generation. You have to consider the continuity of human life, of human culture, of human civilization, of all that we love. And finally, my time is up. The only reality that can bind us is the reality of religion. Secularized Westerners cannot appeal to some atheistic philosophers pro the environment in order to work jointly with Muslims. That's not going to work. I mean, within the West, there's a dichotomy, but much more so outside. So, especially, therefore, those in the West have preserved the Christian tradition in one degree or another, on one level or another, who can work most closely with Muslims. In the Islamic world, many people might be unaware of the dimension of the environmental crisis, but there are very few people who are unaware that there is a God. And even if we don't listen to him, his voice is there, that ultimately his will is done. And without recourse to religion, and without recourse to the teachings which God has given us, upon which all ethics is based, even secular ethics in the West is secularization of Christian ethics. It doesn't come out of a hat, out of nowhere, out of a vacuum. With all that religion had given us, to join hands to be able to face what is certainly the most important challenge that humanity faces today, and that is the challenge of the environmental crisis. Let me end with this and allow you to ask questions. Of course, when I say the greatest challenge that humanity faces, this is on a human level. Otherwise, the greatest challenge is a spiritual challenge, which had it been faced and solved, there would not have been this environmental crisis to start with. But that's a story for another day. All right, I shall stop here. And Dr. Naim, if anyone has any questions, I'll be glad to answer him or her.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nasr. Yes, a few questions have come in. So I will read them to you.
One at a time.
Yes. Right, so I'll just begin with the first one that's sent. Salam, it breaks my heart to see that in most Muslim countries, the matter of the environment is not taken seriously. What happened despite the fact that Islam and the Quran mentions the importance of respecting nature, a amana given to us by God? Why do we never hear Friday sermons about protecting the gift of God?
This is a very good question, because this is a direct consequence of the historical experience of the Islamic world during the colonial period. That is, the Islamic world was invaded and directly occupied in some places, indirectly influenced in other places, like Turkey and Iran. The first instance, North Africa was occupied by the French, Egypt by the British, and so forth, Iraq by the British, and so forth. And the religious force of society tried to direct itself, most of all, to overcoming this domination. And the ulama, who are to blame for this, neglected very much this aspect of Islamic teaching, which had to do with the environment. It's really a practical matter. And the idea what existed, a kind of worship of the West, unconscious almost, you might say, that many Orientals have, that the West has created this problem, oh, they have all the know-how, they'll solve it. They'll solve it. I once remember we had a meeting at Tehran University about this question, and some professors were there. And I criticized it very strongly, some of the things I was doing. And one of them said, look, these problems have come from the West. Let's wait. They know they'll find solutions to everything. Once they find the solution, we'll apply them in Iran. This attitude is very, very much prevalent. And the fact is that in almost all Islamic countries, not all, but almost all Islamic countries are ruled by people who are totally westernized. Look at your own country, Pakistan. You have very good Muslims there, of course, but the ruling class is the heritage of the British period. Your country is not my own country. I've been to Pakistan many times, so I give myself the right to talk about that. It's not my own country. I love it very much. As you probably know, I've traveled there often. I know I have many friends. The present Prime Minister is a very good friend of mine, and I know I've known many of the leading people in Pakistan. It was not their fault. It was not their fault. That is, the whole thrust of their energy was to preserve their own identity, overcoming foreign domination and so on and so on. And they paid very little attention to this aspect of things. But now these are changing quite a bit. For example, in your own country, Imran Khan, is a man who's aware of this. He's very much interested in this. I've spoken to him about this matter, and they're trying to create a university, a Sufi university, in which, in fact, the Sufi view of nature, which is at the heart of the Islamic view of nature. I don't have time to talk about it separately today, but the heart of the Islamic view of nature will be central and will be prevalent. And you have, even in countries like Egypt, with a dictatorship, you have NGOs now being created, which are trying to do this. But the answer to this question is really a historical one. It's not as bad as the person who wrote the question says. In fact, I have a lot of contact with people like that all over the Islamic world, and especially young people, and especially women. It's very interesting. For them in Egypt, at the forefront of the environmental movement are women. It's a new element in our society, in Islamic society. This is occurring, and there are many hopeful signs. But the so-called global order is based on the primacy of economics. It's the primacy of economics, which didn't exist in our traditional society. The word economics, which comes from the Greek economikos, was translated into Arabic at tadbir al-manzil, how to keep a household. There was no science of economics. Now we say iqtisad, but the word iqtisad in classical Arabic doesn't mean that at all. Ghazali has a book I always call it Iqtisad fi i'tiqad, dealing with theology and credo and belief. So this is something new, and but there are very positive signs that are going on, and I hope, inshallah, they will become more and more powerful, these voices.
Thank you, Dr. Nasr. Well, lots of questions are coming in. So let me go to another one. This is from one of our colleagues here at the Department of Theology, Kara Anthony. She asks, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the Quranic recognition of the thou-ness of nature and the recognition of the peoplehood of each kind of animal. What other distinctive contributions does Islam have to environmental thought or action? What more can Christianity learn from Islam about the care for creation?
I think this is, of course, a vast question, but a very good question. The most important is to spread the concern of Christianity from only the human state to the whole of creation. For example, Islamic law, the Sharia, has, even on the level of Sharia, has a great deal of teachings about the treatment of other animals, of animals, of water, of air, of the elements, and so forth and so on, which are part of religious law. Some Muslims may not be aware of it, but it is part of religious law. I think Christianity could learn from that to make the concern for the non-human part of creation more and more a part of Christian concern, the same way as it is for Islam. And don't think of this being a kind of animism or polytheism or anything like that. Or it's not that at all. It's not that at all. It's to realize the sacred in all of God's creation. That, I think, is the most important thing that it's Christians, if you look at their own tradition, that also exists, but it's been forgotten. And Islam has not been forgotten. In ordinary life, of course, a Muslim will do the same thing as a Christian. But there are two bankers in New York, one is a Christian, one is a Muslim. The Muslims are looking always at the trees at Central Park as being sacred, and the Christians are passing, driving by. I don't mean that, but in general, there's this greater awareness, and great Islamic writers, even of the last century, person with whom you have dealt, like Maulana Thanwi, people like that in Pakistan, who lived at the turn of beginning of 20th century, very recently. They have written about this. And I think Christianity can learn from this Islamic tradition to centralize more its concerns for the environment, for the spiritual significance of nature, without secularizing it. The secular environmentalists are trying to find the sacred quality of nature without Christianity. I remember once it was on a Sunday, I went for a walk in a forest, and a Swedish friend, and I said, "You're not going to church?" He said, "No. On Sundays, I come and hug these trees in the forest. That's my church." That was a very honest answer he was giving. I think Christianity in the West can learn a lot, start to prevent this from happening. Because Christianity was neglecting the importance of nature, a lot of people who love nature turned outside of Christianity into this kind of tree-hugging religion almost. That is, the environment became their religion, you might say, to reclaim to reclaim their soul, to be able to present actually a religious view of nature which is meaningful, and to apply it to our situation today.
Thank you, Dr. Nasr. Here's another question. I have to be a little bit picky about them. This is from Hassan Salim, who states, "I'm an imam in a local Muslim community in the United States. What can I do to make a difference and encourage my community to take concrete steps?"
Let me tell you, first of all, an account which is true, but it's like a joke. In Egypt, the government, in order to prevent the Friday sermons from criticizing the policies of the government, had not only encouraged but almost forced all the imams to keep talking about cleaning up the environment. And so the last 2-3 years, with Assisi ruling in Egypt, you keep getting these sermons on Friday about the environment. Although the causes are wrong, but the effect is very good. I think the imams in the United States, although the situation is not the same as Egypt, nevertheless should pay more attention to the religious significance about living at peace and harmony with nature, to respect the rights of all of God's creation. And that also remove a kind of selfishness that we human beings have. And usually the imams preach against, or just give money to the poor, and so on and so on. But to save a duck from drowning is like giving money to the poor. That's usually excluded from the religious view of many people. To expand that, I think, is a very important duty and possibility, and will be very, very fruitful. It's abominable that in the United States, where you and I both live, there's so few Muslims at the forefront of the environmental movement. If I ask you, can you name some, you'll have trouble. And you're a well-known professor, you know almost all the Muslim intellectual leaders of this country. But we have to be able to get in there and do what we can. Let me give you an example which is very interesting for our Muslim brothers and sisters. The law that we can learn from the Jewish people who came to America before the Muslims came, and how they were to establish themselves, how they were to create yeshivas and so forth. So I've spoken about that all the time, but there's also one thing that we can learn. There's a very famous Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Shorsh, in New York. He's a good friend of mine, and many years ago, I gave a lecture for them on the environment. And he told me at that time, that was several decades ago, he said, we Jews have been totally impervious to this issue until now. It's time that we pay attention to this issue. Now that 30 years has passed, look how many rabbis there are who are leaders of the environmental movement and thought in the United States. Why can't we do that? Why can't the Muslims do that? I'm going to die shortly. I'm an old person. There should be 10 people like me speaking. The hundreds, I mean, there are millions of Muslims in the United States. And there's no excuse here that a letter coming from Sisi that you have to give this particular talk. There's this freedom that we have in this country, for which we should be thankful to God, the freedom to practice that religion. But also, we advise our followers to be environmentally aware, to deal with nature with respect, to realize God's creation. Certainly, we're not going to use Islam. I think it's going to be very pleasing in the eyes of God that this situation we're doing that. If you and I were migrants to Virginia or Massachusetts in the 17th century, when the first white people came, at that time the environmental issue was not there. The 3,000 miles of virgin nature in front of you, and nobody thought of polluting nature or destroying nature. It was there. They took it for granted. We would not have had the same responsibility. But we live in the now, and this world in which we live now. This is a very, very important issue to bring out the very rich Islamic tradition. Look at my mother tongue is Persian. The more poems in Persian in the spiritual praise of nature thou could find in all of the European languages put together. I didn't talk today about the Romantic movement, about Wordsworth and William Blake and those people who tried to revive a spiritual view of nature, but not from a purely Christian point of view, so I skipped over them. But how many devout Muslim William Blakes we have? God knows how many. How many poems there are in at least Arabic and Persian. I know these two languages a little bit. And also I know in Ottoman Turkish and your own language, Urdu, there are all this literature to bring this to the fore as much as possible. It's not a form of modernism to be Islamically aware environmentally. It's going back to a very important aspect of traditional Islam, which we now have to apply. We have to apply on many, many different levels. Within the Islamic world, it also includes applying it to architecture, to city planning. Here in the West, we don't have the same freedom to do that. We cannot build Islamic cities in Washington, outside of Washington. But in the Islamic world, we have that element also. So we have to look at the situation, where we are, you and I, and people like us in the United States. What is it that we can do? And that's a great deal. And within that, to act correctly.
Great, thank you. I'm going to put a couple of questions together that raise questions about what you said about, or want more clarity about your view on secularism. And so one of the questions is, thank you for an engaging presentation. You mentioned secularist environmentalists. Can you comment on the role of secularism, however you prefer to define it, as an ally or obstacle or something else to Muslims, Christians, and other religious communities in their various responses to the environmental crisis? There's also a couple of people on that line questioning whether, one person wrote, as an atheist and scientist, I want to work with the people of Islam, Catholicism, anyone that is willing to work to help life succeed on this planet. But you seem to say that I should not try to do this.
Well, let me answer the first question. And the two go really together. Secularists can certainly join hands with Muslims and Christians in dealing with concrete problems. It's like a boat is sinking, has a hole in it. Everybody on the boat tries to pour the water out, whether it's saying their prayers or not on Fridays or Sundays, whether secularists or religious people. There are a lot of issues in which atheists also, that's the second question, can work with Muslims, for example, on techniques of decreasing the pollution of rivers. That atheists might have a lot of knowledge about that. that a Persian or a Syrian might not have, or an Iraqi, and that can be applied to the Tigris River, practical matters of that kind. But I believe to solve the environmental crisis needs another worldview than the secularist. The effects of it can sometimes be solved with the help of secularists. Of course, I'll just give this example. But the deeper causes, I think, are spiritual, intellectual. And once you consider nature to be independent of divine reality, to be an independent reality of its own, I do not believe it is possible to solve the environmental crisis, because once you do that, one doesn't really understand who man is. I ask you this question, which cannot be answered by an agnostic or an atheist. Why is it that a species that is naturally produced through so-called evolution, called man, able to destroy life on Earth? Why is it none of other species can do that? The crocodile cannot eat everything and destroy the life in African rivers even. There's always a balance. There's always a harmony. There's always a balance. Now, some secularists accept that. That's their prerogative. I'm not forcing them to become religious people, or having other causes in their mind that brings about this balance. All right. But on the level of that balance, of preserving that balance, they can work with religious people, whether they're Muslims or Christians. On the level of removing the deeper causes, they cannot, because they cannot agree. They cannot agree. And this is where the great contrast also comes between the Islamic world and the West. Because of secularization that has taken place for 5 centuries in the West, a teacher can go in class here in Washington and teach the children about the environment without any reference to God, to religion, to spirituality, to the living character of nature. If you do that in a class in Tehran, nobody's going to listen to you. It's a reality. I'm talking about a reality on the ground. That difference exists. But on certain levels, in certain domains, it's certainly possible to work with secularists, the people who do not believe in a divine principle. That is possible. And I've done that myself in my life. And all the people with whom I've worked on various issues have been Catholic theologians or Protestant theologians or Jewish rabbis. Sometimes they're secular people, but what they call themselves secular people. What they do is they're imposing the sacred upon its immanent aspect alone. And that's the world of nature. For them, in a sense, the world of nature is the sacred. That is why you and I understand the attribute of sacred, the attribute to the world of nature. So in a sense, they're not deprived of those categories, except they've placed it somewhere else, you might say. And there's still a room for cooperation. We cannot be choosy in this matter. The Western world exists. We cannot cause it to be non-existent. We cannot cause everybody in New York to be like people in Mashhad, going to a sanctuary every day and praying 4 hours a day. That's not going to happen. New York exists. From our religious point of view, God has willed it to exist. It's part of the present situation of the world. And so there are many talents that I'm just using New York as an example. People in New York or Detroit or London or anywhere else have, which can be brought to the table because they know Western technology better than most Muslims know. They know its consequences better than most Muslims know. They can, for example, devise a car that causes much less pollution than cars that our company in Iran or Egypt could produce. That's a reality. And so there's a lot of room for cooperation, especially at this late hour of human history. We cannot be too choosy. Remember the image of the boat that I gave you. the hole in the boat and the water's coming in. You cannot say only those who go to mass in the morning can pour the water out. Everybody has to get together and help. We have those situations.
And, thank you, Dr. Nasr. Maybe one more quick
One more
question.
question.
And so this is from David Penchansky, who's a professor at Department of Theology as well. So he writes, Professor Nasr, thank you for a wonderful and informative talk. Given the basis of Islamic science, how do you account for the greater advance of science in the Christian West?
Science is based on a worldview. What you call advancement of science is only from one point of view advancement, but it's also another form of science. It's a change in worldview. So-called advancement of science in the West, which really begins at the end of the Renaissance, especially the scientific revolution in the 17th century, is based on another paradigm, the Cartesian Galilean paradigm, which cuts nature off from any spiritual or intellectual element, in which the creator is irrelevant. Some people became deists, some people agnostics, but theists had no role to play in the theology of science, and if they did, it was very marginal. There were some people who were theists, including Newton himself, who was not only a deist, he was really a theist. But by and large, you had a change in worldview, in paradigm. And the Islamic world, like the Chinese world before modern times, other great traditional civilizations, which developed a tremendous amount of science. Islam and China, two civilizations, produced a tremendous amount of science and technology. There was something in them of a spiritual character which prevented those civilizations from taking a step into a secularized view of the world. I do not believe that there's simply a linear progress of science from Babylonian science to Max Planck and Einstein. I don't believe that at all. Each science is based upon a worldview. Thomas Kuhn already made that clear when he talked about paradigms a generation ago. Each science develops within a paradigm. And what happened in the Islamic world refused to give up its Islamic paradigm of reality. Whereas the West, because of the weakness that was created in the intellectual aspect of Christianity in the late Middle Ages, the rise of nominalism and many things, and skepticism, Sextus Empiricus were brought back to life after 2,000 years. In the West, because of that, was able to create another paradigm within which modern science developed. And today, just to end my talk with that, it's very important, there are many leading physicists who believe that we are now in need of a new paradigm in modern science. Modern science has reached a dead end. Quantum mechanics solves the problem very elegantly mathematically, but what it means makes no sense. Literally makes no sense. One object being at two places at the same time, or if you use a sentence, but is rationally, what does it mean? It's only empirical evidence that a particle is appearing in two places at the same time. It needs a vision of reality in which quantum mechanics itself will make sense. So we're in need of a new paradigm. And there are very few physicists who are working, Meyer, Smith, others who are working on this. But the unfortunate thing is that the scientific paradigm, including evolutionism and Darwinism, which was added to in the 19th century, has become not really a science, but a dogma. It's a fanatical dogma to which certain scientists cling because they're afraid if that is lost, their worldview would be lost. But at the same time, many more philosophically minded scientists realize that there's no choice. We need to have a new paradigm. And I think traditions like Islam or Hinduism, in which the traditional paradigm is still alive, despite the fact being weakened in some places, eclipsed in some places, is still alive, can play a very important role if the teachings are understood correctly and authentically, and not simply through a Western lens, as many Orientalists do. Well, I think I've spoken enough. been a pleasure to have talked to the students of St. Thomas University. I wish you all well, and I hope one day I shall be able to visit St. Thomas in person again. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Nasr, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you to the audience. And I'm very sorry for those people whose questions we could not get to. There's a link in the chat if you want to access the recording for this. Again, and take care. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Nasr.
God be with you.